Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's member webinar hosted by Wisconsin Cheesemakers Association. I'm Grace Atherton. I'm WCMA's Communications Director, and I'm so glad to have you with us here today as we dive into Resilient Food Systems Infrastructure Grants. This grant program is currently available in 35 states across the nation, including Wisconsin, which is where we will focus our presentation today. First, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. Please make sure to keep yourselves muted during our presentation, just so we don't have any interruptions. The exception there is at the end, we will open it up for your questions for our presenters. So at that time, I'll open things up and you can unmute and ask your question. You can also drop those questions at any time during our webinar in the chat, and we will make sure that we catch those throughout the presentations. A recording of this webinar with a list of resources and helpful contact information will be sent later this week after the webinar concludes, so watch for that in an email from me. With that, we will take a quick look at our agenda for today. We'll start with an overview and some background about the RFSI program and a look at all the details you need to know to apply. And then, as I mentioned, we'll open it up for Q&A with our featured presenters. And speaking of those presenters, you'll see all of these friendly faces on the call today. These are all folks from the wonderful Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection who are working to implement this grant program here in Wisconsin. So we will hear from most, if not all of them, throughout the course of our presentation and our Q&A today. So if you see these folks pop up on the call, they're here to help with any questions you might have about the program. First, though, I'd like to turn it over to WCMA Senior Director of Programs and Policy, Rebecca Sweeney. She's going to walk us through a bit of background on RFSI.
Thanks so much, Grace, and thanks to everybody who joined today. We're thrilled to be able to detail this program because it holds great opportunity for dairy processors in Wisconsin and frankly across the country to modernize their operations and grow. So just want to give you a little bit of background information about where the Resilient Food Systems Infrastructure Program came from. So USDA first introduced this initiative in 2022 to assist small and mid-sized producers and food and farm businesses and strengthen the American food supply chain. We all know that the pandemic revealed some weaknesses in our food supply chain, and to try to ensure that we learn from that and we grow from that, they allocated billions of dollars towards strengthening our food supply chain and also launched a couple of different programs. So two of those programs specifically focused on food systems infrastructure. One of those programs is the Regional Food Business Centers. And of course, today we're talking about the Resilient Food Systems Infrastructure Program. So those centers, there are now 12 of them operating across the country. And those centers offer technical assistance and capacity building for farmers, ranchers, and food businesses to figure out new markets and navigate federal and state and local resources. The other part of that effort was the Resilient Food Systems Infrastructure Program. And $420 million have been allocated to launch this initiative. Next slide. Those $420 million are being allocated to each and every state as well as territories. And what you're seeing before you are 35 states that are currently active with an RFSI program. Those RFSI programs are trying to address the middle of the food supply chain, not necessarily just the farms and not necessarily your grocery stores, your retail outlets, or your restaurants, but everything sort of in between. And many of those states' programs are up and running, including one in Wisconsin. So we want to highlight that on the next slide. Of $420 million in RFSI program funding, about $270 million has already been allocated, including $27 million to Wisconsin. So I really want to highlight this. I'm not sure that the Wisconsin Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection will toot their own horn. But I think that it's important for everybody to understand that Wisconsin received $27 million. The only other state that received more money is California. Now, California, I want to remind everybody, has 39 million people, and we have less than 6 here in Wisconsin. But what we do have is a whole lot of food processing here in Wisconsin. So in part, that dollar figure is indicative of the role that Wisconsin plays in food processing for the nation and for the world. But I also want to say that I think that the department's application was stellar, and they actually got their program set up well before many of the programs that you see now active across the country. So kudos to all the people that you're going to hear from today for their hard work in getting this program running, and for also ensuring that USDA can feel very confident in allocating a very significant amount of money to our state. All of the monies will provide direct-to-business grants, and that's where I'll leave it and pass it back to Grace, because now you're going to hear from all the experts on how you can use those dollars.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. We have with us today, starting us off from the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, we have Grace Poots. She is the Agriculture Program Specialist assisting in implementing the RFSI program here in Wisconsin at the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection. Grace, any other introduction you would like to give yourself? Great name, by the way, or feel free to go ahead and get started.
Sure. Thank you, Grace and Rebecca, for having us. Like Rebecca said, it was an excellent state plan. I had no part in it. That was Kara and Andrew, who you might hear from later. I just started in January, but I'm the person who's responsible for answering questions when they come via phone or email. So if you have any questions after this presentation, feel free to reach back out to us. It will likely be me responding. But yeah, so Grace, you're going to be in control of the slides?
I certainly can.
Okay, awesome. We can move on to the first one. So just to echo what Rebecca said, this is a $420 million federal program that was announced in May of last year. It's funding through the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. DATCP was awarded $27 million, which is the second most of any US state or territory, as she said. And the goal of it is to build Wisconsin's food system resilience. And resilience meaning into the future, long term, for decades to come. So it's an exciting opportunity, and we hope that you'll take advantage of it. Okay, perfect. So going off of that, the program purpose, to build resilience in the middle of the food supply chain, and we'll kind of get to what that middle of the food supply chain is defined as in a later slide, and to strengthen local and regional food systems. So some activities that this program is really targeted towards are the aggregation, processing, manufacturing, storing, transporting, wholesaling, distribution, and I would also add packaging of targeted agricultural products, which are agricultural products intended for human consumption, not including meat and poultry, because there's kind of another grant that's the counterpart of this RFSI grant that is specifically for the meat and poultry industries. So middle of the food supply chain, really how we're describing it is post-harvest and pre-market. So it would include those activities that I just mentioned within the processing and aggregation or distribution stages of the food supply chain. So it's really important that folks that are hoping to apply or in the middle of their applications really focus the funding that they're requesting towards activities and budget items, whether that be equipment or infrastructure development, that's really focused around this middle of the food supply chain. And then funding priorities. There are kind of 6 priorities that the USDA has laid out for states to target funding towards, and those are underserved farmers and ranchers. These can be new and beginning farmers and ranchers, which is defined as less than 10 years of farming experience. Veteran producers and processors, middle of the food supply chain businesses. Veteran producers, processors, and middle of the food supply chain businesses. And then socially disadvantaged groups that are either processors, producers, or otherwise middle of the food supply chain businesses. And these are things that are defined within our RFP, either by the Small Business Administration or by USDA. Another criterion is family supporting job quality and the treatment and safety of workers. So really just improving work quality for Wisconsin agricultural middle of the food supply chain industry. Local project support, which the application really gets into and allows you to expand on who is supporting your project, how it will benefit, whether that be local communities, regional areas, parts of the state. Underserved communities, so this isn't necessarily producers, processors, and middle of the food supply chain businesses, but more so targeted towards communities that maybe don't have access to locally produced food or value-added production. And then they've also prioritized farmer-owned or worker-owned cooperatives, enterprises, and there is a question particular to that on template 2 if you've already started your application. All right, eligible applicants. They can really be just about anyone, but focused in the middle of the food supply chain. So those are agricultural producers and processors. So you'll note that farmers are encouraged to apply. And I know that that isn't really relevant to this group, but just as kind of an example, farmers can apply, but not for anything pre-harvest related, production related, but they could apply for, say, processing equipment to process the food once it's been harvested. And so similarly, if there's a middle of the food supply chain business that may be doing things that are in that pre-harvest post-harvest, pre-harvest or post-market stages, they can apply for the activities that they're involved in the processing, aggregation, and distribution stages of the food supply chain. Same goes for for-profits, nonprofits, local governments, tribal governments, and institutions, which has been defined by the USDA to include things like food banks, hospitals, schools, and other institutions. It's important to note that the applicant must be domestically owned, their facilities must be located in Wisconsin, and that for-profit entities, whether you're a processor, producer, or some other type of for-profit entity, you must meet the SBA small business eligibility requirement, which I'll go into more later. So for those a little bit more or a little less familiar with the grant program, the RFSI grant program has 2 tracks. Applicants may choose to apply for either the equipment only grant track or the infrastructure grant track. And the following slides will get further into detail about them. So the equipment only grants range from $10,000 to $99,999. And as the name implies, they're only for the purchase of equipment. This equipment can be new or used, and the cost of shipping, installation, and setup are also eligible for funding. And it's important to note that there is no match required. So if you apply for an equipment only grant, say for $75,000, and you're awarded, you would get that $75,000 without having to put up any of your own funds. And then the infrastructure grant track ranges from $100,000 to $3 million. And these are designed to expand the capacity and infrastructure for aggregation, processing, manufacturing, storing, transporting, wholesaling, or distribution. So any of those middle of the food supply chain activities. And then match is required for this grant track. It's a 1-to-1 match for most applicants, unless you qualify for the reduced match of 25%. And I'm not sure that I really touch on that in this presentation, but if you have questions about that, I can answer that during the Q&A. Otherwise, it's detailed in the RFPs. And then some eligible infrastructure grant activity examples. These can be expanding processing capacities, adding product types, increasing production volume, supporting new wholesale retail product lines, modernizing equipment or facilities, new facility construction, increasing packaging and labeling capacities, hiring limited term personnel for implementation, special purpose equipment, which you'll note is also an eligible activity for the equipment only grant track, but that can be included within the infrastructure grant track as well. And then increasing storage space. So cold and frozen storage, or aggregation space of a different kind. We can move on to the next slide. And then ineligible activities, acquiring real property. So real estate purchases are ineligible. Expenses incurred before the signed project contract start date. So everything that you're requesting funding for, as well as all of your match funds, have to be incurred between the project start and end date. And then projects focused on ineligible products, which, like I mentioned before, include meat, poultry, and then any agricultural products not intended for human consumption. Research, marketing, and market-related activities, and harvest or production-related activities are ineligible as well. What qualifies as match? I've been sending this list of three questions that you have to ask yourself to people who are confused about the match requirement or trying to determine what they can use for match. And you must answer yes to the following three questions. The first is, can I request the grant to pay for this? The second is, will the cost be incurred during the project contract life period? And the third is it being funded by non-federal dollars? And so those three things have to be, you have to answer yes to those three things in order for it to qualify as match. They cannot be paid by federal funds. They can be cash or in-kind contributions. And so that could be donated time, donated goods, services. For example, if you have volunteers, their time could be put up as match. And they must be allowable costs or eligible expenses. So like I said, the first question, would you be able to request the grant to pay for this? Yes. Okay, then it could be, it could qualify as match as long as it answers yes to those other two questions. And then, like I said, no match for equipment only grants. The infrastructure grant has a 1-to-1 match, so 50% of the total project cost. For example, the applicant requests $750,000 and matches $750,000 for a total project cost of $1.5 million. And then disadvantaged, women-owned, veteran-owned, and historically underserved farmers and ranchers. These are categories that are defined by the Small Business Administration. And if you meet those definitions, you can self-certify to qualify as a candidate for reduced match, which is 25% of the total project cost as opposed to 50%. Grant time frame. So the application period is currently open. It closes at 5 p.m. on Wednesday, March 6th of this year, so in a couple of weeks. Between March and May, USDA or DATCP will do its internal review of applications, and that will involve an external committee of reviewers that we're currently recruiting for. And then we'll put forth the applications we propose to fund to USDA for final approval. They have to review all of the proposed applications or proposed projects from all 50 states and territories. So timeline on this is just an estimated guess, but we're anticipating that by September of this year, funding will be announced and projects can begin. Equipment only grants have 1 year to spend funds from the project start date or the date that the contract is signed. And then infrastructure grants have until March 31st of 2027 at the latest to spend project funds. And then I kind of wanted to walk through some of the resources that we have available to applicants on our website. The RFPs, the equipment only grant request for proposals, and the infrastructure grant request for proposals is where you'll find most of the information necessary, or all of the information necessary to applying for these grants. But then beyond those, you'll find the SBA size standards tool. And this is kind of the first thing that you're going to want to do before you make the decision to apply, is be sure that if you are a for-profit entity, that you qualify as a small business. And so, for example, I use the cheese manufacturing NAICS code, assuming that it would be relevant to at least some, if not most of you. And so the size standard for this industry is 1,250 employees. So if you have less than that number of employees and you're a cheese manufacturer, you would qualify as a small business. The second thing you're going to want to do if you've decided to apply is register for a UEI, or a unique entity ID. And there's a link on our website that you'll go to work through this process, but you will need a UEI to apply. And this is a process that can take a bit of time, so we recommend that you get started with that sooner rather than later. And then the next thing that you'll probably want to do is dig into some of the resources that we have on our website. We held an informational webinar, not dissimilar from this one, on January 9th, and the recording for that is posted on our website. But perhaps more importantly is the informational webinar question and answer document, which was posted alongside the recording, and that is kind of like in addition to our original FAQ document, which is also on our website. So those are two resources to get potentially some answers to questions that you may have as well. We also host office hours. We have two left, one on February 15th, which I've circled because it's coming up this Thursday, and then the final one on February 29th. And then additionally, we have two more resources that have since been posted since I created this PowerPoint, but they are the application guidance document, which I would highly recommend that you look into, as it kind of clears up some of the most commonly confused areas on the application templates. And additionally, there is a budget calculator tool, which you can use when you're creating your budget. That can kind of help you walk through calculating match, calculating indirect costs, etc. Kind of works as a tool to help you in writing a budget. And then you'll theoretically begin applying, and you would use the application templates that are also available on our website. There are two templates for each track. Both of them are required. There is the template 1 and template 2 for infrastructure grants, and the template 1 and template 2 for equipment only grants. And so depending on which application track you are applying to, you would download those templates, fill them out, and then once you are ready to submit, you email them to the email that's provided on our website and on the RFPs, along with any supplementary documentation that might be relevant to your project. And again, the RFPs will go more into detail about those items. And then evaluation criteria. So like I mentioned, we will have an external review committee that will have a rubric scoring all applications. And I think I listed the evaluation criteria for the infrastructure grant applications, but they're essentially the same across both tracks. Those will be the Distress Community Index score, whether or not you are a cooperative applicant, your project readiness, the issue, problem, or need that your project addresses, your project objectives, the beneficiaries of your project, the impact that your project will have, external project support, project management plan, and then your budget and budget narrative. And then this is just an example a screenshot that I took from one of the RFPs, but within each category, it details more of the fine print of what applications will be evaluated based off of. Increasing proposal competitiveness. So these are just a couple of tips. There are no word counts, but reviewers can only evaluate what is written. We're going to explicitly tell them that they cannot make any assumptions. They will only have the templates and any supplementary documentation that you provide them to evaluate your proposals. So the more clearly you articulate project outcomes, budget, impact, beneficiaries, etc., the more readily points will be awarded to you. Program scope. So tie your project back to the intended RFSI program purpose often and as often and as clearly as possible. Something like kind of a frame of mind that I've been advising some project applicants on is maybe think of this as kind of like your resume. Think of think of the RFSI request for proposals as like a job posting. And you want to convince USDA that if you were to be hired to work for them, that you would successfully accomplish the goals that they have laid forth for this program. I think that that's kind of a good way to think about it. And then in terms of items and activities, make sure that you're only requesting funding for things that are eligible, that are related to eligible products that occur within the middle of the food supply chain. And then just to note that the more specific and special purpose the equipment or other funding or the other budget items that you request, the better, the more competitive. Avoid starting an application before reading the FAQ, the webinar Q&A, and application guidance documents. They serve to answer questions and hopefully will clear up some confusion before you dig into this stuff. Avoid requesting funding for general purpose equipment. It's just not going to score competitively on this in this program. And then proposing projects that exclusively benefit the applicant, because really the goal of this program is to promote system level resilience. Just as a reminder, applications are due by 5 p.m. on Wednesday, March 6th of this year, which is in just a couple of weeks. And thank you for listening to me talk for the past 20 minutes. This is the RFSI program email, which again, I am the recipient of. So if you have any questions, either I will answer them or I will get your questions to somebody who does have the answer to them. Yeah, thank you for your time and interest.
All right. Thank you so much, Grace. That was wonderful information. And just want to give everyone a reminder once again that we will be sending out an email after this webinar as a follow-up with all of this great information, the presentation, all of these links that we're putting in the chat, all these details for you afterwards. So if you're taking notes and you missed something, don't worry, we will follow up with you and make sure that you get all the details you need. With that, we will go ahead and open things up now for questions and answers. Let's start with any that folks might have fresh on their minds right now. If you have any, feel free to unmute yourself or you can drop those in the chat as well.
Grace, this is Paul Scharfman. May I ask a question?
Absolutely, Paul, go ahead.
We are going to go into construction of an expanded factory on about the 1st of May. We have committed banks who will loan us the money to do so. There will be further projects in the year 2025. Can I ask for grant funding for the close-in construction and equipment? Because we're going to start before the grant would be awarded, or should I write my grant for that stuff which could happen in the year 2025 if I had funding?
It's a great question. DATCP folks, anyone want to jump in and field that one?
Andrew, do you have this one?
I definitely think that, Paul, you could include the stuff that's going to happen potentially in 2025, but can you tell me again the timeline that you said stuff was going to potentially start in March of this year?
On approximately the 1st of May, the
Oh,
timeline
May.
is we've already got bank financing for $25 million worth of factory expansion, equipment, construction, wastewater, and so on. The shovel goes in the ground on the 1st of May. Construction will be complete at Christmas, and it'll be operational a year from today.
Mm-hmm.
But so the project starts. Is it too late to ask for grant funding for all that?
I would say that if there was like components, I'm sure you're not going to pay write a check for 25 million or whatever it is right off the bat. So if you could divide your project up, that construction up, then maybe just because you're not going to get the full thing funded by this grant anyhow. So, whatever they're doing up front, don't include that in your proposal and maybe just have some piece of that construction for this first part. Just write that in for the grant, you know. So, and then you could use your loan that you've already secured that's going to be paying for some of that as match.
So, Andrew, I listened to you on January 9th. I listened to you again yesterday. Thank you. You
Okay.
know, and I'm glad to hear you're a little confused too.
Well, I think that it's tricky, but you know, for such a big project, if there's a way for you to divide that out, you know, so that you could say, whatever starting on May 1st, I'm not going to include that in the grant proposal. And then, you know, so that's going to, whatever that work is going to be, let's say it's a fifth of the project, that's $5 million. And then I don't know how long this project is going to take or last, but work with your contractor, work with your engineers, work with your bank and figure out like if there's a way that you could say phase one, we're going to do this, you know, this part of the project. And then phase two is going to start August 1st. And that is going to be covered by this portion of the loan. And it's going to cost $10 million starting on August 1st. Maybe that's not the way you wrote it out right now, and that's not the way you planned for it. But I think as long as you can separate those things and then write about it and differentiate those expenses, then
How
it would
soon
be
can I say the
eligible.
project will start? Because what I'm hearing is, Paul, you can't
Oh,
start your
yeah.
project until the 1st of September because there's not going to be a decision.
Yeah, so I think originally the start date was going to be sometime in the summer. And I can't remember off the top of my head, Grace, if there was a suggested start date in the RFP. I can't remember, but
I
that's
believe
a
it was
little
June.
bit flexible depending on how quickly. So the review process happens in Wisconsin. Those recommendations have to go to USDA for their approval, and then it comes back to each state. Now they're doing that for all 50 states, you know, so it might be a little bit naive to think that that's going to happen super fast. So I know that USDA, like we hired Grace here, USDA is doing the same thing. They're building up their staff to handle the additional workload. But I think the intention was for projects to start in the summer.
So,
but it might be later than that. I don't know.
So the sticky wicket, the difficulty thing is, I got to write a grant which says it's not I haven't made the decision yet. I can't do this without your money. And that means whatever, and
Wow.
that the decision date for that could well be after Labor Day. So I'm going to be building a plant, and if you decide on the 1st of September to award the money, then I will say yes to the following chunks. But they're not going to be able to tell me when the project starts until they award the money. If I've already spent the money, they can't, the award's of no use. Am I getting that right?
I don't think you need to be that worried about it. It's true that the timing for you is not great, but I think that there is a way for you to kind of still apply for the project with some of the work that you have planned, the construction that you have planned in the future.
Would it be okay, rather than me taking up all of your time this afternoon, if I write to WATC RSFI at wisconsin.gov, can you and Grace work with me by email?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, then it's enough about me. Thank you for the time. I'm glad I'm not
Paul.
the only one confused. I'll mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Andrew, as well, and Grace for pitching in on that question. We do have a few more in the chat, so I want to make sure we get to those. We have a couple from Orphe of Alpenage Cheese over in Oak Creek. Do we need to include specific quotes with the application? And does each quote need to be exactly what is purchased if approved? For example, the same supplier and price?
No, that's the short answer. Quotes, bids, exact estimates, that's an oxymoron. They work to make your project more competitive because they demonstrate your project readiness, but they are not required, especially for each budget item. Estimates are really what we're looking for, the average price that something might cost you. We understand that you're not going to know what you're going to pay for something potentially in 2027. Kind of the rule of thumb that we've been giving people is that up to the price that you have listed can be funded by the grant. Anything beyond that, you'll be responsible for. So it's a bit of a balancing act between you don't want to request too much because then the reviewer is going to say, well, you don't need $10,000 for this budget item. We're not going to approve it. But you don't want to request too little either because then you're going to be stuck footing a chunk of the bill. So where you can get quotes, it would be beneficial, but they are not required. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. And another one from Orphe, does the RFSI grant need to be for a completely different project than may have been partially funded already by another grant? So for example, if a company applies for a Dairy Business Innovation Alliance grant through WCMA and the Center for Dairy Research, secures that grant, but it only partially funds a project, can they then apply for an RFSI grant to cover the remainder?
I will say that federal funds cannot be used if a project is already being funded by a federal grant. It cannot be funded by this grant. It would have to be a project that was distinct enough from what you've already received federal funds for in order to be funded by RFSI. But in terms of state grants, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that you can request RFSI funding for the same or similar project that is already being funded by a state level grant.
Yeah, and just to clarify, you can't use a federal grant as match. It is possible that you have funding that comes from a federal grant, and that if you can justify and explain how that this funding is not going to double pay, you're not going to supplant. They use that word a lot, but they're not going to supplant payment or funding that you already have. Then you can get a grant, a federal grant, and have another federal grant that's paying for something, a different piece of the puzzle or a different project or part of the project that you just can't, like, say, ask for $1 million for a piece of equipment that some other grant is already paying for. But that's hopefully that's obvious. But there is no restriction for if you got $1 million to pay for this $10 million piece of something, and then you want to ask them, for another federal grant to get another $1 million to pay for a piece of this project or whatever it is that you're doing. So that's fine. It's just that you can't match federal dollars to get more federal dollars. The only exception to that rule is if any of you have an FSA loan. They're kind of breaking the norm here and allowing FSA loans to be used as match. And of course, the FSA loan has to be a loan for something that's an eligible activity, and you can only use a portion of it that you're going to be paying or utilizing for the life of the grant. Similar kinds of restrictions on that. But yes, Grace, you're right. You can match a state funding to get a state-funded grant to get a federal as part of your. So if you have a state grant for something, or let's say maybe you have a private foundation, you have a grant from a private foundation, you can use that funding as match to on this grant. You just can't use federal dollars.
Sorry, it's Orphe. Just a quick question. I guess I'm going to make it easier just with an example. I was just talking about the subject of the grants. So let's say, for example, we have a packaging project. The packaging project could include so many, material equipment. And I'm just saying that if we got a packaging project already approved, I'm not talking about trying to have more money to buy the same piece of equipment, but just pretty much
Mhm.
the same subject, say, well, we
Yep.
have another packaging project because we need another machine to do some packaging. Can
Yep.
we do it for the RFIC, or you guys are gonna rate it and say, oh, that's weird. The packaging project, they already apply for that through another DBIA grant or whatever grant. So it's
Yep.
refused right away. Because
Yeah, it won't be
I feel
refused right away, but you do need to kind of articulate. It's a similar kind of answer. If you're asking this DBI grant to help you figure out this packaging issue, and then you're going to apply for a different grant, RFSI or any, to help you figure out this packaging issue, you're basically getting funded to do the same body of work twice. So, you know, in most grants, there's like, you just need to differentiate, like, oh, we're figuring out this for this grant. And even though it's about packaging, that's fine. You just need to make sure that you're paying for something different. So
oh yeah,
it's just a
definitely
different, but
yeah, for
what
sure.
you said is fine. It can be about the same subject matter.
So that's mean we need to disclose on the grant whatever money we already got in the past, because if nobody does this, I don't know how you guys are going to verify that.
Right.
I'm just wondering, because
yeah,
I don't know
so
how you're going to check that, but
Are state funded grants tied to the UEI, or is that just federal funded grants, Andrew?
that is, yeah, that won't matter for the UEI. I mean, that so for like the specialty crop lot grant, there is a question on that application that says, is part of this project funded from some other federal source? And
okay.
But I think for the RFSI, there isn't a question for that. So if there's no question on the application, then don't worry about it. And I don't know, I'm not particularly personally involved in any kind of risk assessment or evaluation that happens outside of the actual application. I'm just saying that in general, there's no rule that limits you from applying for the same subject matter. You said packaging. That's okay. The only rule that that you need to be aware of is that you just can't ask for funding to do the same thing or pay for the same thing.
Okay,
and
that
you
makes
sound
sense.
like you understand that.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
So for a lot of folks on the webinar today, they're familiar with DBIA grant funding. And
Yep.
this is not dissimilar, right? To say it in a different way, Andrew, we talk a lot about phases and phasing out projects in a way that allows you to make sure that there's not overlap for double payment. So for anybody who, and I think almost everybody on this webinar has been engaged in DBIA at some point. We've gotten this question over and over again about federal funding, and it's smart for you to try to phase out projects. So let's say you're applying for DBIA and you're also applying for RFSI. You should distinctly differentiate between at least phases of your project to make sure that you're not going to see overlap in payment. And so that if someday your lucky number is pulled and you get audited on a grant, you can show everyone that you were not double dipping, right? Nobody in the group intends to do this, but our advice to everyone is to make sure that you're distinctly different when you're applying for different grant monies. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit as well. I know there were a lot of questions around this same topic.
I have been a reviewer and an applicant, and now kind of like behind the scenes with the building it out, and to some degree in the administration side after the grants are active. And I've gotten my number randomly called, so I've gone through the audit process, and yeah, you know, you just want to make sure that I think for the most part, everyone is probably doing the right thing, but you just want to make sure that you've got your records clear and there's that distinction. It is the RFSI, the language is coming from USDA. One of the big things that they have talked about is you cannot use this money to pay for something that is already being paid for. Like they're not here to try to just like help you put some money in your pocket, but to actually pay for a piece of equipment or infrastructure. And if it's already paid for through some other grant, federal grant, then you potentially could probably have to pay that grant back. I think, and I don't know what other repercussions happen. But.
Okay. I have a couple more in the chat, one that was sent to the group and one that was sent directly to me that I want to make sure we cover real quickly before we wrap up in a few minutes here. First one, I hope will be sort of a straightforward answer, but we'll see. Can companies with manufacturing locations in multiple states apply for an RFSI grant in each state where the manufacturing plant resides and projects would be completed? Or should they focus on one RFSI grant application in just one of those states?
It's the same. It's a similar answer to what Orphe just asked. I don't think there's anything that's stopping a company in multiple states to apply for multiple grants, but you just want to make sure that what you're asking for is different. So I imagine if you're large enough to be in multiple states, you're probably going to have different locations or different kinds of equipment needs. And so maybe it's easy to have a building in one state be built or updated or some kind of expansion and then a different kind of expense related for a different project in a different state. And that's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I don't know the process that USDA has for checking for anything that would be supplanting funds. But
Okay.
I'll also add that the company needs to meet the SBA size standard, the relevant SBA size standard. It's not the manufacturing plant has X number of employees and it's less than the size standard number of employees. The entire company needs to be considered a small business in order for that manufacturing plant to apply.
Yeah, great point, Grace. And that's based on your UEI. So if for some odd reason you have like a nonprofit arm, or if it's somehow it's divided up in some kind of way where there's a different UEI, then maybe there's a way that you count. Usually then for the NAICS code, it's based on employee count or gross sales, I believe, some kind of revenue. And so that if you don't meet those, then you're not eligible to apply the small size standards.
Okay, we're getting more questions in our chat, which is fabulous, but we've only got about 10 minutes left in our session today. So these next ones we're going to try and make kind of rapid fire if we can. I have one asking whether there is some sort of insight you can offer on how DATCP approaches the number of grants to give versus the amount for each grant. So is there any sort of element of, we'd rather do 10 grants for 2.7 million or 100 grants for 270,000? Is there any, is that a factor or not really?
It's not. We're trying to spread out the impact across the geographical area of all of the state of Wisconsin. And to really prioritize the funding priorities that the USDA has laid out that I mentioned in one of the first slides. There is no set aside dollars for equipment only versus infrastructure grant tracks. It's just going to come down to the scores and to who the Secretary of Agriculture feels can make the greatest impact in all areas of the state. So there's not real good advice that I can give on that question.
Okay. Another question about a project similar to Paul's that he referenced in the beginning. The construction project has started, but this person knows they will have about 12 million in construction and equipment expenses in 2025. So they're wondering, can they still continue with their application if they can speak to the different phases in their budget narrative? Is that okay to continue applying?
Yeah, I think based on everything that we've talked about today, that would be just fine. For example, if there is a particular part of the facility or a set of equipment that you know that you're going to be purchasing at some point down the line, apply for that, and you can talk about how it relates to the broader scope of the entirety of your project, but just make sure that, like people have said, that it's distinct from the other phases of your project.
Okay. And the last one that I have in the chat here, are grants only one-to-one or something less? Grace, can you just real quickly recap that match versus the no match for each of those tracks?
No match for equipment only grants. For infrastructure grants, there is a one-to-one match unless your business or the main applicant, whoever that is, qualifies for reduced match. And you can get further instruction and guidance on that in the RFPs.
All right. And this, I think we covered a bit, but is evaluation criteria only what we saw, or does it include size of the ask? I think the answer I heard from you is it's the criteria that you saw in those slides, and that we'll share with attendees afterward, right? There's not really any other elements that are hiding in there that you're considering,
there's no hidden evaluation criteria.
It's exactly what we saw.
It's
okay.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. One last question. We at WCMA have gotten many requests from members for letters of support to go along with their applications. Is that helpful? Is it needed? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think that, so if the association is writing letters of support, that would speak less to beneficiaries and more to the external project support component of the evaluation criteria. So for example, if your letters of support are speaking to the need for the project, how this could benefit the greater dairy or cheese industry, things like that could definitely go a long way in the external project support category, which includes, or you score points on that based on external stakeholders, which it sounds like WCMA would be. Okay. External stakeholders meaning those that are not directly benefiting from the project.
Okay. Final call for questions. Any last questions from the group? We've got about 5 minutes left. I think we covered a lot of wonderful ground here. And again, we will send out a follow-up email with a whole lot of helpful resources, contact information, a link to this recording, and all of the slides and resources that have been shared. So stay tuned for that in your email. I'm not hearing any final questions. Rebecca?
One to me is very specific. It is, can we use this training funding for training in Spanish? Any thoughts from Team DATCP on that?
I'm not sure what training you're talking about, but in general, this grant is not for like education or training purposes. I mean, there's a few examples listed in the RFP about like, you know, a HACCP plan developed was one example, or kind of getting staff up to speed if you're gonna like implement a new system. So there's maybe a possibility there, but in general, I think that the bulk of the grant is focused on these capital expenses around infrastructure or equipment.
However, I will say training employees on equipment use or new processes, things like that, is an eligible expense. And so if your employees are Spanish speaking or don't use English as their first language, and the Spanish training is necessary to the success of your project, I think that there definitely is room there to include it. If you have a more specific example and you want to email it to the inbox, we can kind of mull over it and work with you on it in particular. But I would say that there is an opportunity there, but it's not a definite, yes, it's eligible.
Yeah, I would definitely say it has to be like training for using equipment or training for doing something with the infrastructure, you know, that's middle of the supply chain, and it would be targeted towards like staff versus just broader education purposes.
Okay. All right, with that, we are going to wrap up and get everyone on their way within the hour here. I want to just put in one quick plug for our next member-only webinar, Tuesday, March 12th, once again at 1 o'clock Central Time. We are going to be covering materiality assessments. This is a topic that we've heard about from members as they're getting started in their sustainability journey, working on those sustainability efforts. And materiality assessments are really the first step toward going down that road. So we're looking forward to covering that topic and diving in with WCMA members on Tuesday, March 12th. You can go to wischeesemakers.org/events to register for that right now, and we will announce our featured speakers in the coming weeks, so stay tuned for that. With that, we will close up for today. Thank you so much to our presenters from the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. You have done a wonderful job sharing your time and answering all of these detailed questions and giving us so much wonderful information today. We appreciate your time so much. And thank you all for joining us on today's webinar and giving us an hour of your time to dive into this program. We appreciate it, and we're here to help. So keep an eye out for that follow-up in your email later this week, and we will see you next time. Thank you.